Well, good morning. I bring you greetings from Central Seminary in Overland Park, Kansas. It's a new site for us. We moved there in early 2025 after selling our building in Shawnee, Kansas. We decided it was time to right-size our space and downsize some of our furnishings. And so as a result, some of our library shelves made their way here to Dallas, to your library. Because of connections, we have 3 special people in this congregation who serve on the board at Central Seminary: Gail Ashby, Don Hallman, and Helen Moore Montgomery is our board member emeritus. So they were very instrumental in helping this as it began to happen. And then Barbara was the one who kind of picked it up and brought everybody and made it happen. If you've never seen Barbara do physical labor and get her grandchildren involved and do it, I have seen that. Her grandchildren reluctantly participated in the taking down of shelves, but it is always good to share. And what I really believe is that in God's economy, when we end something with furnishings, sharing them means they get to live again. And so being part of life with you here at Wilshire means that our shelves are still living and being used in wonderful ways in God's kingdom. So thank you for that, participating with us. So Wilshire, you are celebrating your 75th anniversary this year. It's a beautiful and wonderful milestone, so congratulations. Congratulations on 75 years of worshiping together, 75 years of service, and 75 years of showing up for one another and for your neighbors. It's a joy for me to be here with you in this season of celebration and thanksgiving, and together to give thanks to God for all that God has done in and through this church for 75 years. Now, 75 years is not just a number, it's a testimony. It reflects the generations of people who have gathered in this place, who have prayed, who have sung, who have wrestled with faith, who have found hope, and who have built something lasting together. Now, some of you are lifelong Baptists like me. Some of you are newer to the Baptist experience. Some of you may be reluctant Baptist. And some of you do not identify as Baptist at all, and yet we gather together in this place, and perhaps at home or at work, virtually, we gather together participating in the faith community that is Wilshire Baptist Church. And that itself is something important. As a Baptist congregation, you know that church does not begin with denominational identity or with institutional affiliation. It does not start with confessional statements or formal structures. Those are wider expressions of our faith, and they're important, but they are not foundational to who we are as a church. For Baptists, the story of the church is always best told through lived experiences of a particular people in a particular place. And my story as a Baptist began in Fort Sand, Texas. Anybody heard of Fort Sand, Texas besides Gail Ashby? She's from Midland, so she knows where Fort Sand is. I grew up the first 6 years of my life in Fort Sand, Texas, attending Fort Sand Baptist Church. And that particular community shaped what I believed about church. It shaped my early faith. It was where I first understood what it means to be church together. It was not just an idea, but it was lived out among the people who walked with me, who knew me, who formed me, and who, more importantly, loved me. And that experience at Fort Sand Baptist Church shaped how I continue to understand what it is to be church, even today. Our Baptist tradition calls us to understand church in a deeply particular way. Church begins and ends with a local congregation, with communities like Wilshire, places where faith takes root and grows and is lived out, places where we come together as the people of God. When I think about those kinds of communities, I cannot help but hear the words of 1 Peter chapter 2 a little more clearly. Our text today offers us one of the most compelling images in all of Scripture for understanding who we are as the people of God. And the passage begins with an invitation. Simple and almost tender in its tone, it says, like newborn infants, you should long for pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow into salvation. So here's an image of dependence, of hunger, and of growth. It tells us that faith is not static. It's something that deepens and develops. It matures over time. But the writer of 1 Peter does not stop there with nourishment, but moves quickly on to talk about identity. And not just individual identity, but communal identity. And the writer says, as you come to Jesus, the living stone, rejected by mortals and yet chosen precious in the sight of God, you are like living stones and are being built into a spiritual house. Now that phrase, living stones, is striking because stones are not usually considered to be living things. They are fixed and immovable. They're lifeless. And yet in this passage, the writer reimagines them. They're not cold, dead materials. They are people who will respond, people who choose, people who are shaped and placed together by God into something that is sacred. And then comes the language that has echoed across the centuries of human and Christian life. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people. And this is not just poetry. It's a declaration of identity and purpose. And for Baptists, it resonates at a deep and foundational level for us. Because at the heart of Baptist life is the conviction that every person stands before God as a priest. Every individual has direct access to God. No mediator is required. No institution can control that relationship. No earthly authority can determine the terms of faith. And this is what we often call the priesthood of all believers. And that belief is inseparable from another core conviction that we hold as Baptists: freedom. To the royal priesthood, to be a part of that means you have to be a free people. And not free in the sense as being free from the autonomy of God, but free in the sense that our relationship with God cannot be coerced, it cannot be compelled, and it cannot be controlled by external forces. The idea of freedom is one that Baptists have long held tightly to. It's not an add-on part of our theology. It's woven into our very identity. Baptists have long been a freedom-loving people, not because of cultural habit, but because of theological conviction. And our Baptist story begins with that conviction. In the early 17th century in England, in a world where church and state were tightly intertwined, where religious conformity was enforced by law, a small group of believers began to ask difficult questions. Led by John Smith and Thomas Helwys, these people were not content to simply accept the religious structures around them. They studied Scripture, they wrestled with its meaning, and they came to conclusions that set them at odds with the established church, the Church of England. Smith and Helwys came to believe that the church should be made up of those who had consciously and personally responded to God's call, and that baptism would follow that confession of faith and not precede it. That faith must be voluntary and not imposed. So these ideas that seem so ordinary for us today, in that time, they were radical. In England, citizens were required to attend the Church of England. They were required to have their infant children baptized. They were required to support the church financially and to conform to its teachings. And failure to comply could result in fines, imprisonment, and even worse. Smith and Helwis and their companions could not reconcile the requirements with the reading of Scripture that they were doing. And so they left. They fled England and went to Amsterdam. And they sought a place where they could worship freely together. And there in Amsterdam, around 1609, they formed what is now recognized as the First Baptist Church in history. It was a small beginning, just a handful of believers who gathered together in a foreign land, choosing to form a community based not on coercion, but on conviction, not on tradition alone, but on personal faith. So in every sense, a community of living stones was our beginning as Baptists. Each person had chosen to be there. Each person had responded to God's call. Each person was part of something that was being built, not by human authority, but by divine purpose. But the story does not end in Amsterdam. Thomas Helwis eventually made the decision that would define his legacy. He chose to return to England. He knew the risk. He knew what awaited him back in England. But he believed that the truth that he had discovered needed to be proclaimed so that all people could hear the good news. And he believed he should do that even in a place where his speaking would be restricted. Before returning to England, he wrote a book, a short declaration of the mystery of iniquity. And he addressed the book to the King of England, King James. And his words were bold, even shocking for their time. He declared that the king had no authority over the conscience of his subjects, that matters of faith belonged to God alone, and that those of other religions, whether they be Catholics or Jews or even Muslims, should not be punished by the state for their beliefs. It was a clear, uncompromising state of religious freedom. And it came at a cost. After returning to England, Helwis was arrested, and he was imprisoned in Newgate Prison, which is considered to be one of the worst prison conditions in all of England at that time. And in Newgate Prison, somewhere around 1616, Thomas Helwis died. So one of the founders of our Baptist tradition, a man who believed that faith must be free, died a prisoner because of that belief. And he was not the last. But as the Baptist movement began to grow in England, so did the opposition to it. Many Baptists faced persecution. They were heavily fined. They lost their homes and their livelihoods. Some were whipped. Some were imprisoned for years. And some died as a result of their convictions. They suffered because they refused to surrender their freedom of conscience. They suffered because they believed that each person must be free to respond to God. And they suffered because they understood what it meant to be living stones. Living stones are not shaped by force or coercion. Living stones are formed through relationship with God and relationship with one another. And that belief, Baptists carried across the Atlantic to colonial America. And while America would eventually be known as the land of religious freedom, that freedom was not equally applied, especially in the early years. And Baptists continued to face resistance. They were sometimes taxed to support churches that they did not attend. They were sometimes prohibited from gathering for worship. They were sometimes imprisoned for refusing to conform. And those stories, powerful stories, often overlooked stories of individuals who stood firm in their conviction, are part of our Baptist story. An elderly widow named Esther White refused to pay a tax to support a church to which she did not belong, choosing imprisonment over compromise. A mother, Martha Kimball, was taken from her children one cold winter night because she would not violate her conscience. ordinary people who endured extraordinary hardship, not for political gain or social status, but for the simple right to worship God freely. And these are not just historical anecdotes, they are testimonies. They are our Baptist testimonies. And they remind us that freedom that we so often take for granted was costly. It was preserved by people who believed deeply that faith must be voluntary and that no one can be forced into a relationship with God. And this is where 1 Peter speaks so powerfully into our identity. The author says, "You are a chosen people." Notice the tension that comes with that phrase. We are chosen by God, and yet our tradition tells us that we have the freedom to choose. These are not opposing ideas, however. They exist together in a sacred kind of balance. God calls, we respond. God builds, we participate. God chooses, and God invites us to choose back. This is the mystery and the beauty of being living stones. We are not passive objects. We are active participants in God's work in building here on earth. And each one of us bring our own story, our own response to faith. And we come together in a way that none of us could do alone, but we together build a spiritual community shaped by faith. And then the text says to us, "You are chosen so that you might proclaim the mighty acts of God who called you out of the darkness into marvelous light." And this is where freedom finds its purpose. We're not free simply to believe whatever we want. We are free to live differently, to speak differently, to love differently, to bear witness to the transforming power of God. And our Baptist ancestors understood that. They did not want to fight for freedom as an end in itself. They fought for freedom so that the gospel could be proclaimed without any distortion or coercion, without interference. They believed that when faith is free, it is also authentic. And that belief continues to shape us. To be a Baptist is to hold responsibility and freedom together, to affirm that every person has the right and the responsibility to seek God, to interpret Scripture, to respond to grace. It is to trust that the Spirit is at work in each and every believer, guiding, convicting, and leading. But it also reminds us that we are not alone. We are living stones, but we are built together. Our freedom is personal, but our faith is communal. We belong to each other. We learn from each other, we challenge each other, we support one another. We discern together what it means to follow Christ in this time and in this place. And that means freedom must be exercised with care. So my questions for you today, my friends, are these. Will you use your freedom to build up the community or to divide it? Will you use your freedom to listen or only to speak? Will you use your freedom to serve or only to protect your own interest? And these are not abstract questions. They are deeply personal and practical. They shape the way we live as a church, as a people, as living stones that are being built into something sacred. And then the final reminder from our text this morning is this. The writer says, "Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Once we were not a people, but now we are a people. Once we had not received mercy, but now we have." This is our story. We are called to be God's people, living stones. We are called to be a royal priesthood. We are called to be a people shaped by faith and called to responsibility and faithfulness. And so, Wilshire, as you celebrate your 75 years of life together, this is both your story and your calling. You are people who've been built over time by grace, shaped by worship, by relationships, by hard questions and deep faith. Generation after generation, stone upon stone, God has been at work among you, forming you into something that is more than any one life could hold. And the good news is this: God is not finished with you. The same God who has been faithful in your past is still at work even today in your present. The same God who has been faithful in the past is already at work in your future. So the question before you is not simply what have you built, but what is still being built? What kind of community will you continue to become? What kind of witness will you offer in the years ahead? How will you live as people who have received mercy? Will you be a place of freedom that is used to build up, not to tear down? A place where every voice is honored and every person is invited to do the work of God. A place where faith is lived and not just proclaimed. Because that is what it means to be living stones, to keep showing up, to keep being shaped, and to be placed together into the work that God is doing here in the world. So my prayer for you today in this 75th anniversary year and throughout your future is this: may you continue to be a church where faith takes root and grows, a church where freedom and responsibility are held with care, a church where mercy is not only remembered, but is lived. 75 years in and still being built. Thanks be to God.